something nobody in mainstream media is telling you right now, and you need to hear this clearly, is that what is unfolding between Iran, the United States, and America's Arab allies in the Gulf is not just another news cycle. This is a fundamental restructuring of the entire power architecture of the Middle East, and it is happening right now in real time, while most Americans are still trying to figure out what actually happened in this war. Iran has put a preliminary figure of $270 billion on the direct and indirect damages it suffered from the U.S.-Israel war that began on February 28, 2026. That number is not a final accounting. Iranian officials have made clear they are still calculating the full toll. Oil and gas facilities, petrochemical companies, steel plants, and aluminum factories were repeatedly targeted, alongside military complexes, and the government says these will take years to fully rebuild. But here is what makes this moment genuinely historic and deeply consequential for every American watching this unfold. Iran did not stop with demanding compensation from Washington and Tel Aviv. Tehran formally demanded war damage compensation from 5 neighboring countries: Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Jordan, accusing all 5 of enabling the U.S.-Israel military campaign against Iran. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about the geometry of power in that region and what Iran is doing with this legal and diplomatic maneuver. These are not just nations that sat on the sidelines. Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, Amir Saeed Iravani, sent a formal letter to Secretary General Antonio Guterres asserting that these 5 countries committed internationally wrongful acts by allowing their territories to be used by aggressors, and in some cases, directly participating in unlawful armed attacks against Iran. Iran is telling the world through the machinery of international law that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and Jordan are not innocent bystanders. They are co-defendants in a war crimes complaint filed with the highest international body on the planet. Now let's slow down and really understand the body of this story, because the hook only scratches the surface of something far deeper, far more dangerous, and far more transformative than a dollar figure. Let's start with the battlefield reality, because you cannot understand the diplomacy without understanding what actually happened militarily. The U.S. and Israel launched 40 days of strikes on Iran before a ceasefire was brokered by Pakistan beginning on April 8, 2026. 40 days. And in those 40 days, Iran suffered damage that its own government assessed as potentially ranging from $270 billion on the conservative end all the way to as much as $1 trillion. Let that sink in. These are not numbers being thrown around carelessly. The Iranian government assessed the damage to their own economy as at least $300 billion and possibly as much as $1 trillion by April 11, 2026. Oil infrastructure, industrial capacity, military hardware, the backbone of an economy that, for all the years of sanctions, had still managed to sustain a large and complex society. All of it shattered in 6 weeks. And yet here is what the Western narrative conveniently skips over. By March 19th, the cost of the war to the U.S. military alone was estimated at $18 billion, and the Pentagon was requesting a further $200 billion. That tells you something profound about the scale of this conflict. This was not a quick surgical campaign. This was an industrial-scale war, and it cost the most powerful military in human history an enormous amount of money, men, and machinery, and they still could not break Iran into submission. Iran did not collapse. Iran did not capitulate. Iran held the Strait of Hormuz as a card until the very last moment, forcing a ceasefire where Tehran came to the table not on its knees but with demands in hand. Iran's counterproposal to the United States included not just an end to attacks but security guarantees against future U.S. and Israeli aggression, war reparations, and international recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. Read that again. Iran demanded recognition of its sovereignty over the most strategically critical choke point in global energy markets. Roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through that strait, and Iran walked into the negotiating room at Islamabad and put that on the table as a non-negotiable condition. The talks in Islamabad, brokered with Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and facilitated by J.D. Vance on the American side, ended without a deal. The ceasefire clock is running. Officials are now considering a second round of negotiations, with the White House confirming Trump is open to resuming in-person talks before the 2-week ceasefire expires on April 21st, or potentially extending the ceasefire itself. So right now, as you watch this, the Middle East is sitting on a fragile temporary pause in a war that has already reshaped regional politics more dramatically than anything since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now let's talk about the Arab allies, because this is where the story gets genuinely alarming for the nations that bet everything on Washington's protection. White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt indicated that President Trump is considering asking Arab countries to cover the expenses of the war, noting that it is an idea Trump himself has. Trump's instinct here is not accidental. It mirrors a precedent that goes back decades. During the Gulf War of 1990 to 1991, a coalition that included Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE funded approximately 88% of the $61 billion campaign to liberate Kuwait from Iraq. Trump has always operated from a transactional framework, and his view of American military power is simple. If you want us to fight for you, you pay for it. He has said versions of this his entire political career. He said it about NATO, he said it about South Korea and Japan, and now he is saying it through his spokesperson about the Arab Gulf states. So here is the impossible position these Arab monarchies now find themselves in. On one side, Iran is coming at them through the United Nations with formal legal demands for reparations, accusing them of war crimes under international law for hosting American and Israeli military operations. Iran's ambassador explicitly stated that the conduct of those states in allowing their territories to be used by aggressors qualifies as an act of aggression against Iran, and that these countries should make full reparation, including compensation for all material damage caused to Iran. That is the language of legal accountability. That is the language of culpability. Iran is treating Saudi Arabia and the UAE not as neutral parties, but as belligerents who bear financial responsibility for the destruction of Iranian cities and infrastructure. And on the other side, the United States, their supposed protector and the reason they opened their air bases to begin with, is now looking at these same Gulf states as ATMs for American war expenditures. They are being squeezed from both directions simultaneously. Iran says you owe us for the war. America says you owe us for the war. And these nations, who by most accounts tried desperately to prevent this war from happening in the first place, are now holding the bill from two directions. Zaidan Al-Kanani of the Arab Perspectives Institute put it clearly: this would have made sense if it was those GCC states that advocated for this war to happen, but they actually advocated for the war not to happen. That is the cruel irony buried in all of this. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others were warning Washington for months before the bombs started falling. They sent delegations, they worked back channels, they appealed through Oman, through Pakistan, through anyone who might get through to Tel Aviv or the White House. They understood, with the geographic and economic intuition that comes from living next to Iran, that a war on Iranian soil would detonate consequences across the entire region that no one could fully predict or control. They were right. And now they are paying for being right in the worst possible way, by being blamed for a war they tried to stop. By March 31st, the cost to Arab countries from the conflict was already estimated at over $120 billion. That is damage from Iranian missile and drone strikes on Gulf infrastructure, energy facilities, cities, and economic assets. Saudi Arabia absorbed strikes. Abu Dhabi dealt with fires and disruptions. Bahrain, which hosts the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, found itself essentially a declared target in Iranian strategic calculations. These nations paid a real price in blood and treasure during the war itself, before Iran even formalized its reparations demand. And now they face the prospect of paying again, this time through diplomacy and international legal mechanisms. Iran has also raised the idea of collecting compensation through a Strait of Hormuz protocol that would include a tax on ships passing through the waterway. This is perhaps the most strategically audacious element of Tehran's entire post-war posture, because what Iran is effectively proposing is a permanent revenue stream, backed by the implicit threat of closure, that would function as a continuous reparations payment extracted not just from the United States or the Arab Gulf states, but from every nation in the world that depends on Gulf energy exports. Japan, South Korea, India, China, Europe. All of them would effectively be subsidizing Iran's reconstruction every time an oil tanker transited the strait. The United States flatly rejected shared control over the strait. Iran stated plainly that the U.S. has no connection to the Strait of Hormuz, so why should it control it? That is a sentence worth reading twice, because it encapsulates Tehran's entire negotiating posture. Iran emerged from 40 days of American and Israeli airstrikes with its territorial integrity intact, with its government functional, with its military battered but unbroken, and with the confidence to tell the United States of America, the country that just spent $18 billion trying to bring Iran to heel, that America has no standing to make claims over a waterway that Iran views as its sovereign domain. This is not the posture of a defeated nation. This is the posture of a nation that believes it survived something that was meant to destroy it, and that survival has created a new form of strategic legitimacy. Iran's ambassador to the United Nations argued in his letter to Guterres that Tehran was subjected to a flagrant act of aggression by the United States and Israel in violation of international law and the UN Charter, and that Iran was acting in self-defense throughout the conflict. Whether you agree with that framing or not, you have to understand that Iran is not presenting this as a negotiating position it is willing to trade away for sanctions relief or a nuclear deal. Iran is presenting this as a matter of settled international legal principle. They are saying we were the victims, these 5 Arab nations were complicit in victimizing us, and under the laws that govern this planet, they owe us compensation. Full stop. Iran also rejected UN Security Council Resolution 28117, which condemned Tehran for what it called egregious attacks against Gulf states, calling the resolution manifestly unjust and legally untenable. And they are right to note the extraordinary nature of that resolution. It had a record 136 co-sponsors and demanded the immediate cessation of all attacks by Iran against its neighbors. 136 nations lined up to condemn Iran. That tells you something about the geopolitical isolation Tehran faces. But it also tells you something about the limits of that isolation, because Iran is still standing, still negotiating, and still making demands. What you are watching unfold right now is a collision between 2 incompatible legal narratives. The world, as represented by 136 UN member states, says Iran was the aggressor against its neighbors. Iran says the opposite. It was the victim of US-Israeli aggression, and the Arab nations that hosted that aggression are legally liable. Both narratives cannot be simultaneously true under international law. The resolution of that contradiction will define the legal architecture of this region for a generation. And here is the part that should matter most to an American audience. The United States is not a neutral observer in this legal battle. American military bases sat on Saudi, Bahraini, Qatari, and Emirati soil when strikes were launched against Iran. Iran's UN ambassador explicitly accused those nations of breaching their international obligations by allowing their territory to be used for US military operations against Iran. If Iran's legal argument is accepted even partially in any international forum, it creates a precedent that fundamentally threatens the entire architecture of American basing rights across the Middle East. Why would any nation host American military assets if doing so makes them legally liable for whatever America chooses to do from those bases? This is the quiet earthquake underneath the louder noise about dollar figures and ceasefire timelines. The war's immediate phase may be paused. The legal, economic, and structural aftershocks are just beginning. Iran's chief negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, blamed the United States for the failure of the Islamabad talks, saying his delegation raised forward-looking initiatives, but the U.S. failed to gain the trust of the Iranian delegation. That phrasing, failed to gain the trust, is diplomatic language for a fundamental breakdown. Iran does not trust American commitments, given that the United States has walked away from the JCPOA before, given that sanctions were reimposed even after Iran was in compliance, given 40 days of bombing. The distrust is not irrational. It is historically grounded. The ceasefire expires April 21st. The second round of talks may or may not happen before then. The Strait of Hormuz may or may not reopen fully under a lasting agreement. The Arab Gulf states may or may not find themselves formally named in an international legal proceeding. None of this is settled. All of it is live. What is settled is that the map of Middle Eastern power has shifted. Iran absorbed the blow. Iran is still standing. And Iran is now presenting the world with a bill, not just financially, but morally, legally, and strategically, that nobody in Washington or Riyadh or Abu Dhabi has a clean answer for.